Hey everybody, today is Monday, May 6th, 2024. Coming up on the show today, from Three Body Problem, editor Michael Ruscio.
I think that what you withhold editorially when you're in a situation of limitations is critical, because I know this is all I have, and maybe I have this for 10 minutes of filmmaking. At the same time, I need to parse it out so that it feels its own thing.
And assistant editor Josh Carley.
Our episode has pretty conceptual visual effects and some big scenes, and it was like, what do we have? What can we start working with? And it was a matter of getting that in the Avid, seeing what was there, really getting in touch with visual effects and being, what's the idea? What's the plan?
Yes, all that and more on this edition of The Rough Cut. Well, hiya. My name is Matt Fury, and this is my podcast. I call it The Rough Cut, but you are more than welcome to call it whatever you like. Because it's not the name at the top that matters, it's the names underneath. But not my name. What I mean is it's the guests on the show that matters, not the name of the podcast or my name. That's all I was trying to say. Maybe let's start all over. Welcome to The Rough Cut. Today we are talking about the Netflix hit series Three Body Problem. Three Body Problem is based on a Chinese book of the same name. Well, not exactly the same name. It was probably in Chinese, I imagine. And there was also another Chinese TV series based on that book. Both the book and the Chinese TV series had a passionate fan base. Therefore, all the more reason to give it another life for so-called Western audiences. And so they did. A big part of the they in this equation is showrunners David Benioff and D.B. Wiess of Game of Thrones fame. The very simple Wikipedia description of Three Body Problem reads thusly. An astrophysicist who sees her father beaten to death during a struggle session in the Chinese Cultural Revolution gets conscripted by the military. Due to her scientific background, she is sent to a secret military base in a remote region. Her decision at that base to respond to contact from an alien planet implicates a group of scientists in the present day, forcing them to confront humanity's greatest threat. It is a pretty wild series, lots of science. I really can't begin to describe it in depth, which is why we have guests that actually worked on the show. Joining us today are assistant editor Josh Carley and editor Michael Ruscio. Michael and Josh have a lot to tell us about working on Three Body Problem, specifically their episode titled Judgment Day, which contains probably the biggest VFX/action set piece in the whole series. Exciting stuff. That's why you want to keep listening. So much so that you're going to sit right there while I drop some science of my own that can help you be a better, even more informed filmmaker. Let's start with the informed part. If you want to learn all that you can about the incredible editors and filmmakers featured here on The Rough Cut, something you absolutely have to know is that over at blog.frame.io/theroughcut, that's what you call a URL, I'll even give it to you again, blog.frame.io/theroughcut. Over there is where you can avail yourself of a transcription of these interviews. That's right, a transcription, as in you don't have to listen to me talk. On top of that, the beauty of this exciting new thing they call a blog is that the topics we discuss and the references we make here on the podcast can be brought to life with timeline screenshots, behind-the-scenes pictures and videos, even fun things like Spotify playlists. You know how I love to talk about those needle drops. And if you think you can still handle listening to me talk, you can even listen to the podcast through the embedded player on the blog while you follow along with all those great supporting assets I mentioned. It's like film school on a web page. So visit blog.frame.io/theroughcut and get schooled. Here's something else for you. Did you know that composer Ramin Djawadi, the guy that did the theme to TV shows like Game of Thrones, Westworld, and Fallout, also did the music for Three Body Problem? You did? Well, did you know that you could get his music for your next film or TV show? Well, you do now, because his work is part of the Extreme Music catalog of production audio. Who is this Extreme Music I speak of? Well, they just happen to be your basic A-list, talent-driven production music company that creates and licenses music for use in television, film, advertising, and online media. So get over to extrememusic.com for your next project and dig into their vast catalog of production music from the best of the best. You just do a quick and easy keyword search on things like instruments, genre, speed, vocals, era, mood, composer. They give you back tracks in various lengths and with pretty much whatever instrumentation you need. You can even search for music that sounds like a reference track you give to them. All that power in one simple-to-use website where you can do all the licensing online or maybe get a little help from one of their reps at an office near you. So the next time you need the very best in production audio out there, check out extrememusic.com. Okay then, we have a little three-body problem to solve. Here to help us with that are editor Michael Ruscio and assistant editor Josh Carley. It's almost like you've worked together before.
Yeah, we've done it. We spent a couple weeks together, you know.
Michael, if my research is worth anything, and it often isn't, you have a connection to veteran TV director Minky Spiro, who also directed the Judgment Day episode of Three Body Problem. Tell me about your history with her and if and how it factored into you working on Three Body Problem.
Minky and I worked together on a pilot called Crash and Burn for Hulu, and it was really pretty amazing, and it followed a group of young kids at different ages. So they were sort of in their pre-10s, and then they were late teens. And there was a shooting that happened in a school, and Hulu was very high on the project, but this was shortly after one of our many mass shootings that we have here in the States, apparently. And so that didn't go. And we loved working with each other. It was so great. And I went off to work in Prague. And then we connected again on another show for Netflix, Pieces of Her. Minky directed all the episodes, all 8, and there were two editors, but we were closely involved with each other. And Minky and I just got along like a house of fire, and then went our separate ways for a while. I was doing other things, and then I talked to Hamid Shakud to wish him a happy birthday, and we were on the phone with each other for 40 minutes. And at the very end of it, he said, we're having a huge episode, like a Battle of the Bastards episode, a Three Body Problem. And the editors are in the UK, but we really need to bring on somebody to do this massive episode. Would you be interested? This is like at minute 41 of the conversation. And then as it turned out, Minky was the director, and Alex Wu, who I knew from True Blood, who I both edited and directed one of his episodes in True Blood, was one of the producers along with David and Dan. So those planets kind of aligned, and Minky was able to give a good word for me in the UK, as was Alex, and then they brought me on. So then we were basically a team that came together really fast. They talked about it, and it sort of took a couple weeks to get it together. And then I was like, whoa, okay, massive episode. I'm out of rotation with all my people. I put out some feelers, and one of the roads led me to Josh, who got an excellent reputation from Gwen Shavelski, and I knew Scott Turner, who he'd worked with as well. And you were in New Orleans, right?
Yeah, I just finished a show I was on called The Old Man. That was on a Friday, last day, and my family was, we're from Louisiana, and so my wife and my kids were down visiting family, and the plan was I was going to go join them when I was done. So finished The Old Man on Friday, got on a plane Saturday to go home. Didn't have anything lined up, so it was like that age-old fear of what's the next gig. And I believe on a Thursday evening, I got a text from a friend that said, hey, Three Body is in immediate need of an assistant, I believe was the language they used. And I was like, sure, never in a million years. But yeah, sure, here's my resume. Yeah, they're not going to call me, but I'd love to throw my hat in the ring. I had no idea all of this was going on in the background. And I just know that on Thursday evening, I put in my resume, and I believe it was Friday afternoon, Michael called me and was like, hey, you want to do this thing? And I was like, wow, yes, let's go, let's do it. And then flew back on Sunday, and by Monday they were installing the equipment.
And there was already a project that was in a UK form, because they had done a couple of previs type of things that they had. And so we had that, and then Josh needed to import that from the UK to LA, and that was a really interesting transition because we had to hit the ground running, but we needed to get the project sort of in our groove, and we had to find a groove together really quickly. And we weren't in an office, so we were working from our respective homes. Josh had just come back. I was here in my swanky garage converted office, really needing to power down immediately. So Josh needed to find a way to pretty much instantly understand, where I was at with, settings and how to work things, and make this project compatible to our flow.
How did you do that, Josh? That's a lot to unpack. Michael sort of summed it up pretty simply. Josh had to get this project assimilated. What went into that?
Well, I think I'd seen some version of the first 3, maybe. So knowing okay, this is what the show is, this is how they're kind of setting it up, this is how we're approaching things, that helped a lot. At that time, they had an assistant in LA, Derek, who had inherited some of the London stuff and at least tried to get it like operational. So, whenever they installed the system, I got on, I did everything. And it was a lot. It was a lot of stuff. And at that point, we were like asking Michael, how do you like things? And really a lot of it was, well, maybe we'd like to do it this way or this way, but this is the way we got it. So this is the way we're going to do it. And I think it was a lot of adapting to what we had versus what we could do. And there was I believe there was like some rough preliminary cutting, but Michael, didn't you? I mean, you basically started from scratch, right?
I started from scratch. It's like there was a couple of things that were, like I say, previs, and I think that there might have been in Piccadilly Circus, they had shot something without Asa Gonzalez, without the actress. So I think they had something there you could have like a visual of the place with a double, because they had a very limited time schedule to shoot that scene, and that was a cherished location, and then the actress got COVID. So that needed to happen. One other time they came back, and then we also did a blue screen version of that.
Yeah.
So we had sort of 3 versions of that together. The fortunate thing, I think, was that, Minky and I had a shorthand, so we could dialogue back and forth. But of course, it's like the 8-9 hour difference of whatnot. And because Josh was such a literate television audience, he was able to kind of hone in on those early episodes, and we could talk about that together and sort of figure out, okay, how does this fall in line? And it started to.
Yeah. Well, I think knowing Minky informed a lot, because when Michael started cutting the scenes, obviously there's a lot of figuring it out, and certain scenes in our episode were sort of straightforward and others were, obviously not so much. But knowing Minky and knowing how Minky shot, I really think that helped us get through the first cut in a way that maybe otherwise would have been much more chaotic. And I also think a big part of it was figuring out where the heck they were on a lot of the previs, because our episode has pretty conceptual visual effects and some big scenes. And it was like, what do we have? What can we start working with? And it was a matter of getting that in the Avid, seeing what was there, really getting in touch with visual effects and being, what's the idea? What's the plan? And trying to, as quickly as we could, get on page 1 with them, because this is not a show where we could go rogue or they could go rogue. It has to be an immediate hand-in-hand relationship to make sure everything goes. So that was a huge part of it, was getting on the same page with them and making sure that we were heading in the direction that we needed to be.
Well, I've heard editors pay a lot of nice compliments to their assistants. I don't think I've ever heard the term literate applied to one. Not to assume that most are illiterate.
My mom will be so happy to hear that.
But I'd love to flesh that out and know how that actually applied. You said it was an advantage because he was so literate on thinking in terms of references to things. But how did that actually play out, him being literate and looking at those, I think you said earlier episodes?
Certainly when I would start cutting scenes, the way that we work together is that I would put together my first cut of a scene and then give it to Josh. And basically Josh would, do a sound effects and sometimes music pass. We sort of shared in the music, but he really did a lot of the heavy lifting with the sound design and the music design. And what I would do is I'd show him the scene and then we talk about it. And I just would want his honest opinion about it. And this is the way that I've been able to keep people in the loop in the COVID times and in these working from home times, is understand their input. They're the first audience. So Josh would just be very honest with me about, okay, this doesn't make sense. I don't know where they're coming from here, either geographically or emotionally. This plays really well. This will tighten up. This will see what happens after I do the sound effects pass and send it back to you. Then I get a break for a few days. Then I get it back from Josh after he's done massaging Magic Pass, and then look at it again with fresh eyes and say, oh, right. And then maybe there's another way into the scene, or perhaps when I have a scene that's next to it, I realize, oh, right, these are the same transitions into both scenes. We can't have a dolly in both times in a row. And Josh was able to understand that film language as well, just sort of, say, well, this shot is really good or whatnot. And I think that back and forth just really became valuable to me, that I could trust someone who could tell me the truth about what wasn't working. And he doesn't compliment easily. So he's also a little bit reserved. And so it's sort of like, okay, I know that he's not going to like be bullshitting me.
Yeah, in the short time I've known him, I get that sense. Something else you said this episode, you called it the Battle of the Bastards episode, which I think is on point because that obviously is a famous episode from Game of Thrones. David Benioff and D.B. Wiess, showrunners here for Three Body Problem. What about those guys? Did you have much interaction with them and get any sense from them about what they were trying to go for?
You know, they gave me access in the very beginning. So, you know, I needed to meet with them on Zoom so that we could all talk. And how I presented myself to them was basically, I'm sort of a never say die editor. If there's another way into it, or if this value isn't happening in a scene, I'll always really drill down on it and take it to the mat, which is a really desirable claim and hard to live up to. And that appealed to them. And as it turned out, that was essential in completing this episode. And then what happened later on we sort of ended up adopting several of the other episodes. But just to hone in on episode 5, Judgment Day, there were many times where there was so much rethinking, and that the way that they do their versions is their alphabets. So it'd be like, 105 producers cut X. So there's a whole alphabet before that. And, and these are basically the same scenes, although there was additional photography and there was rethinking, which is another part of the conversation. So I would say that they took that to the bank about my claim about being able to drill down no matter what.
Well, and no, for me, that was one of the great experiences of this show for me is right. Because when you're on cut X, you've looked at a scene however many times, you've looked at every frame of the footage. Michael's like, no, don't worry. There's still some tricks we can pull out here. And I'm like, how, and every time he'd do a different pass at a scene, I was like, wow, just watching someone really work footage in the way that he did, I was like, this is incredible. It never would have told me that scene 10 on cut X would look, like this, but it does. And that was one of my favorite parts of working with Michael and being on the show, is watching how much he can work the footage, how much he can build a scene. I mean, there's no shot in our episode that he didn't pour himself into every shot and every edit, and it's been watched and thought over and combed over. So it's quite incredible to watch it, and to know how much work Michael and the guys put into it.
Michael, I believe you said you were out of sync with your people. Could we elaborate on that a little bit? What does it mean to be out of sync with your people?
Oh, let me clarify what I mean by that. Is that Autumn Firenbaum, who I was working with before on Pieces of Her, was my assistant and really great. And she was able to move up. And so she moved up and she was cutting a movie. So what I sort of mean is I was out of rotation with the assistant that I was just working with. So, I was fresh to find someone new to collaborate with.
Okay, so I thought you were referencing what order stuff was shot in and working with the other editors. I'm glad I asked. And since I did ask, how did you collaborate with the other editors?
Well, Anna Hauger was here in LA, and for a while we had offices that were near where David and Dan and Alex were, and that was in Hollywood. So we were able to at least have lunch together and talk about scenes and whatnot. And then I had a relationship with Katie Wieland and Simon Smith, who were in the UK. Katie and I sort of had a big sort of handoff at the very beginning, and it was initially her episode. And then we talked a lot about that, and we were able to talk a little bit about the guys, especially from Katie. Simon was new to them as well. Simon and I didn't have a lot of interaction until really the end. And, I would say that because of the locale, it really became about Josh and I more than anybody else. And I think that was the brain trust, if you will, that really was the editorial fulcrum of the whole episode 5, especially.
Yeah, and for us, it was interesting because, you had the two editorial teams in London, but from an assistant side, they were working on like a totally separate Nexus system than we were. So Michael and I had 5, and Anna and Derek had 6, but they had all the other episodes over there, and so it was an effort to make sure that we were all in sync. And so we had developed a method with London where they would send us their projects, and then we'd let them know, like, okay, this is the offline media, and then they do the same. And so we were constantly trying to keep up to date with what the other cuts were, making sure everything was online. That way we could, even though, there's 8-hour time difference, we could always have the episodes to watch. If nothing else, we can at least see, okay, this is where they're going with it. This is what they're doing. But 5 really was a special kind of monster to work on.
When I talk to people to let them know I was going to be talking to you guys, like, oh, that's such a complicated show and so many characters and so many things to manage. Wow, you got to let me know how they did it. To which I say, just listen to the podcast. It's funny. The series is called 3-Body Problem, but it also feels like it's got 3 genres too. And depending on which episode you watch, it could feel like a psychological thriller, especially the first couple of episodes, or sci-fi fantasy. Episodes 3 and 4, you have this, virtual reality sequences. But when you get to your episode, Judgment Day, the 5th one, it becomes kind of like an action movie where there are big set pieces wrapped inside these setups of, these are the goals, these are the consequences. We often talk about, at least here anyway, the challenge of developing and maintaining a tone on a show. This show almost feels like it does have a shifting tone.
It does, and I think that was the thinking, that this was, in a way, a standalone episode that was going to be a departure and closure at the same time. They were able to pull up some things from the first book into this episode. And so this is almost like a finale in some ways. And then the series sort of resets with episode 6 and becomes something else for 6, 7, and 8. So I think tonally, we had, of course, the older Ye, we had the characters, we knew sort of where they were at, but it's also just sort of like a little movie and the mission that, was set up. And one of the changes that was made, I think later in the game, is the very opening scene was with Wade and Raj when they're on the deck. And that scene was shot for another episode, put into yet another episode, moved into yet another episode, and then we got the scene. And it made sense as a framework to say, I'm commissioning you for this very important project. It's much more important than anything else you're doing. And it gave him a stature, Raj, and it gave Wade sort of this man pulling the strings. And it gave us that frame. Because initially, there was a scene that was taken out that started the episode that was a direct pickup from episode 4 where they have the raid. And they're again sort of talking about Wade is going through the history of the do not answer and all of this and sort of filling in this panel of people. And that was what sort of started a series of really interesting rewrites. This is a little bit of a sidebar, but basically they rewrote sort of Wade's lines in that scene talking to this panel. And so I was the off-camera Wade, really talking very spitfire fast to get these words in behind his back. And so that kind of started off. They also discovered that we had this facility for this temp ADR, which was extremely evident with the Sophon sequence because that went through so many alterations. And Josh's wife, Jamie, became the temp Sophon voice with Josh's direction and modulation of her being like a Sophon. And we would put those temp words in because it went through so many different rewrites.
So you said sidebar. I think this actually leads perfectly into what I wanted to ask you next. Your episode features probably the biggest VFX spectacle in the series.
Yeah.
But it starts with the first, I think, 9 or 10 scenes are all 2-character dialogue-driven scenes.
Yes.
Pre-credits, as you said, you have Wade and Raj sort of sizing each other up. Then you have Clarence and Ye in this interrogation.
Yes.
Then you have Augie and Jin discussing their situation in the safe house. Then we go back to Clarence and Ye in the interrogation.
Mm-hmm.
And then a sequence between Wade and Clarence. Then a sequence with Evans and I can't remember Felix, I think is his name.
Felix.
And then sort of a one-sided conversation between Evans and the Santi Lord, who we don't see. And then back to Clarence and Augie, with Clarence pitching Augie and the idea of using her nanofiber technology to disable the Judgment Day ship. And then one more scene with Clarence and Augie in the lab firing up her nanofiber technology again. And this is sort of the first real bit of tension in the episode because we don't know yet whether or not Augie's going to live. She had that countdown going if she was working on her, quote, science.
Mm-hmm.
So after you get through all of that, again, 2-person in every scene. And then after that, the wheels are in motion for not just the big action sequence at the Panama Canal, but really the rest of the series. Michael, you talked about this a little bit and just the nature of, I had to rework this here, and that showed up in another episode at one point there. But just that notion of the first 20 minutes, very dialogue driven, a lot of context, a lot of build up. Maybe I guess what I'm asking you is to sort of elaborate a little more on how you reworked all of that. And if you were conscious of the fact that, okay, well, I've got a lot of setup here and it's a lot of dialogue, and then all hell breaks loose in the back half of the episode.
I'm glad that you asked that question, because so much of sort of setting up the sandbox is the wooden perimeter, which is what all of those scenes are. They are two character scenes. And to keep those taut, like where Ye and Clarence are sitting in that interrogation room, they're just both in their own circles of the ring. So there's no place to hide. You have like a shot through the video camera lens is all you really have. So that was actually one of the trickier things about the whole episode is that sort of that back and forth, keeping it tight, keeping it tense. Augie and Jin in the safe house must have gone through 20 different permutations. That was one of the difficult scenes to edit in the whole episode, believe it or not. Bizarre as that sounds, because they took out lines, we moved things around. We had to have a certain blocking where she comes from the window to the table and sits in the chair. And that within all of that, how is that still staying in relationship? How much tone can you have in terms of humor? What is the relationship showing? Clarence and Wade. Again, Josh's voice. My voice is as Wade. Josh is Clarence. We're adding lines. It's like, how do you make that information and keep it be suspenseful? And how do you balance it editorially when you're having many off-camera lines? How do you make that balance so that it's not sort of jarring that you have this ADR line coming out of nowhere? How do you structure a scene that is going to have off-camera ADR so that it feels natural, that like, oh, this is the style of the scene, is that people are listening. Quite a lot of it, people are just listening to the other character. And is there a flow to that comes naturally? And still, keeping us on that tightrope until we get actually to them in the trailer before we see who they called Jose, the guy with the hose in the deck. And one thing that we did move up that was interesting was initially, the scene with Evans on the boat with Felix was later in the episode. But then what we decided to do editorially is that when, Clarence says, well, do you want the good stuff? They're about to go Panama Canal, Judgment Day. So it's like, oh, Judgment Day. So we cut to Judgment Day, the boat, which is sort of then, I think that also helped us get, okay, there's going to be meat here, hold on to the rib, because we're going to tease you with this and this will come back. But we moved that up for that reason.
As I mentioned before, like watching Michael, knowing like, okay, we know what's going to happen in the episode. We know like once, you get to a certain point, it's just like you've gone up on the roller coaster. Now we're just down for the ride. But watching Michael work the scenes, because he's like, let's keep these scenes moving. They're building the relationship. They're building the tension, but watching him work the scenes to where they would go. And I think another part of it was great is that, the guys, Dan, Dave, and Alex were not precious with anything. And so anytime Michael would talk to them, make recommendations, maybe we move this here, maybe we lift this here, they were always really open because it was important to them. I mean, they knew too. And so they were always open to, okay, maybe we can lift this, maybe we can move this, and just tightening it into what you see now.
When I ask questions like I'm about to, I always get a little nervous because you never know if the editor's just going to come back with, well, that was in the script. That's what they shot. What do you want me to do? But I'm going to ask anyway, because sometimes you strike gold or something like that. In that scene, that interrogation scene, the net result was 2 close-ups, 2 over-the-shoulder shots, 1 low angle facing Ye, a wide profile 2 shot, but never a low angle of Clarence. But later on, when we come back again, there's a high angle of Clarence. Mm-hmm. I don't know if they gave you more to choose from, but going with a low angle of Ye and a high angle of Clarence, what's the psychology there and what drives the cutting in a scene like that? Is it the performances, the tone of what's being said, your sense of rhythm, or I guess all the above?
All the above, and it's interesting because there was a real impulse on the part of the showrunners to combine those 2 scenes, but there was a costume difference and there was really no way to do it. So they were two different scenes and it had to be separated. They couldn't merge because of practical reasons. So I withheld certain shots for the second part and made it so that that felt like its own entity, that there was sort of a little bit looser in the first part. And I think that we get sort of tighter a little bit when we drill, he starts drilling into her in the second part. And that I think that what you withhold editorially when you're in a situation of limitations is critical, because you're saying, okay, I know this is all I have, and maybe I have this for 10 minutes of filmmaking. At the same time, I need to parse it out so that it feels its own thing.
So if we're going to talk about this being the big spectacle episode of the series, we really should talk about the spectacle. As an editing team, you're somewhat at the mercy of what footage you get and when it comes in. You have this big action set piece, big visual effects set piece in your episode, and then a lot of dialogue-driven scenes. Will you try and tackle the big action set pieces first because of how technical they are and the turnovers and all that? Or do you prefer to save them for last because you have a little more freedom to loosen or tighten them up to accommodate any of the pacing changes and the reworking you just talked about doing in those dialogue scenes?
Well, certainly initially we'd start working on the Judgment Day because we were sort of integrating live action with what the concept was and what the geography of the inside of the boat was and who could get, spoiler alert, sliced first and how that could be kind of metriced out throughout. But essentially, I'm staying up to camera. So whatever they're shooting is what I'll be doing first. I try to be as much up to camera as I can, and that may be that's scene 83, and then the next scene I get will be scene 3. So I'll get that together, and my process is, wow, now I have scene 84. So now we can sort of think about how this works together. Certainly with like the previs stuff, that could be cut and sort of done as a template, and then maybe replacing with live action shots within that and finding out, oh, wow, that looked really good in the previs. It looks a little different now. So, how do we get this to be the sort of same result with really different shots or very different angles or a whole different concept, perhaps, what they were able to actually do with principal photography?
So, Josh, hearing you and Michael talk about the work that you do overall, just how meticulous and detail-oriented Michael is, I wouldn't assume there's a lot of downtime or a slow time for you anyway. But comparing the support you give him on those dialogue scenes versus the Judgment Day sequence, what is the difference? Is there a lot more work to do for the visual effects set piece, or is it the same in the end?
Usually, there's more involved in like the Judgment Day or the final game sequence. But, some of the other scenes, specifically, there was one with Will and Saul on a beach where like they're literally sitting in front of an ocean. So the audio that we have is not ideal. So there's a lot of work that goes into just like cleaning it up and making sure everyone can hear it and that Michael is like, okay, this is going at a good rhythm. And so there's a lot of scenes like that. I mean, when you're in an interrogation room, it's limited anyway. So I just keep with that and make sure that what you're really focused on is the dialogue. But, for me, I love dialogue scenes because I love sound and I love getting to finesse them and play with them. But no, I mean, like for me, the big fun scenes like the Judgment Day and then at the end, that's where I really get to have fun. I always give everything back to Michael. I make sure that he's good with what I'm doing, especially whenever you have previs. And the previs was really good. It was really detailed. Always trying to make sure we were on top of it. But previs can only tell you so much. So him and I wanted to make sure that we were really elevating, at least emotionally, with the sound, with the audio to make it feel as big and as awesome as we were hoping it would be. And it is. So spending a lot of time there and then getting revisions in the previs and making sure that everything is like, especially like towards the end, it's like they're reconceptualizing this or doing that. And then keeping up, making sure the sound's good, making sure that it sounds consistent, that, and that we're still delivering the whole package all the way through to the end.
You guys are really good. You hit on every question I have before I get to them. So rather than just scratch it right off the page, I'm going to say, hey, when you're doing sound design on dialogue scenes on the beach with waves and birds, tell me about the challenge of that. You kind of already said, boy, that's a pain in the ass to do.
It was. And then at first it was just like adjusting the volume and doing some EQ work. But then they finally got us the RX denoiser. And that was a lifesaver.
But you also have a cadence and a continuity to the waves. Like it also affects kind of the editing, I think.
Yeah, and that was another scene that moved around a couple places because it's sort of the one off movie scene in the episode. And so I think that we found ways through Josh's sort of initial sound design, sort of like getting those waves, getting us in the Panama Canal, having sort of a aqua
A lot of water.
continuity and sort of getting us sort of like at sea a little bit. So that gave it kind of a sonic reason to be there, which was, I think that Josh helped fill in those gaps to have it have a place.
Let's explore a little bit the turnover process for a sequence. I'll call it a sequence like that, the slicing of the ship. How many iterations does that go through, and how do you organize that, Josh, whether it falls to you or Michael, you do it yourself? How do you like to organize that in the timeline? Do you like to hang on to a lot of that stuff, or do you like to just sort of flatten things and really just work with the most recent elements?
I mean, when you have a sequence like that, I mean, there's a certain amount of just chaos to it, I think, anyway, that you have to embrace. Like, there's just going to be mess on the timeline. There's a lot going on, and you just have to like learn to love and embrace that. But a huge part of it, like with such a big sequence, is making sure, like, okay, we're in simpatico with VFX, and so it's a constant communication with them, constantly getting previs and making sure everything's up to date. We try to minimize surprises. That's a huge thing. And just making sure Michael has all the tools and all the assets he needs to construct the scene in the way that he sees fit.
And we would have weekly reviews as well with VFX to sort of stay, in sync with them. But, interesting little side note about that sequence is that initially, where, Augie and Wade and Raj was a different location, basically, that when they have sort of like, there's the party ship that comes on and it sort of reveals now like a camera that's sort of hidden. They were initially like hidden up there in an undisclosed part, and they were sort of in this what we call the duck blind. And so they were in this little hut, with thatches and sort of disguise and whatnot, and seeing it, from that vantage point. And then, we made the decision through the guys thinking of, let's have them at a sort of more remote location, which helped us to be able to create the sound environment where basically you had this horror show on the ground, and they were, in the ivory tower looking at this through monitors, and it allowed us to, it sort of weirdly humanized it, because you sort of are seeing this from afar, and it's sort of like, okay, that's really fine for you to see and watch this. And yet when we're down below, it sort of feels very, very visceral, as you know from seeing it.
And I think whenever we did Michael did his first pass inside the trailer, and I used some of the audio, and I just like, okay, well, mix it down and play it from the speakers. And we sent it to them, and they were like, no. Like, it needs to be like dead quiet whenever we cut into the trailer. And we're like, okay, well, and as soon as we did it, we're like, oh, that's incredible. Especially like when you get to the end and the ship's like falling to pieces, and it's just like this massive just explosion of noise and destruction. And then you cut inside, and, Michael did a wonderful job balancing the two to really maximize that effect. But pretty early on, they're like, as soon as we go into the trailer, it's like, you hear none of it. And I think it works so well.
And it was also tricky in terms of the monitors telling the story, especially about how like the poles came up. And that was something that we had to really stay in line with, making sure that VFX was up to the latest story point. So that was a two-way street, where basically we would redesign things in editorial and maybe still be working with old comps and old previs, and having to sort of say, poles lock into place, without really having that shot over a shot of like the pole midway. It was very Chiron heavy of us doing the leading in a lot of places. And so we were being led and leading at various times in the process.
Well, Michael used the word visceral in describing that scene. Something I noticed, and I'm sure it's intentional, lots of focus on children in this sequence. Again, it goes back to, well, this is the footage they gave me. But tell me about that focus on the kids, just to make it that much more visceral, to steal your word again.
Well, it's what that's going to happen that you never really see. I mean, we never chop a kid, but, that little pre-sequence while everyone's sort of waiting around, and we've got like the cafeteria and the little girl, and then we have, Felix at the monitor, and we have Evans, sort of, and it's all, with this sort of like somewhat ominous, like they don't know what's going to happen, but we know they're on that boat. And you do see like the kids playing basketball, and you do see that one kid that's up against the fence who, we know what's going to happen to him, but we're not showing any of that. And I think that was able to, there's a human price tag of this, just getting this hard drive. I mean, it's a radical approach to procuring something as opposed to, having a spy infiltrate or like a scuba diver steal it or whatever else that they could have maybe done. So it's devastating. And I think that the cost of seeing with children is great. And I think it's sort of the metaphor of those paper dolls being sliced, which is just chilling. Mm-hmm. And that tells you everything that you sort of need to know as far as the fate of those kids.
So we talked about just the visceral nature of the scene. Somehow at the same time, a little more comedy is introduced. I mean, this show isn't a laugh riot kind of show, but you have the character Wade, who certainly gets some good lines in here or there. But, in the midst of that sequence, or right before that sequence begins, you have Wade talking to Augie about Raj. He says, I don't trust him. Double check his work. And then later on, he says to Raj about Augie, I don't trust her. Triple check all her work. So, he's kind of the comedic foil. And at this point, you're adding comedy as the stakes go up. So tell me about playing up the comedy versus the drama and how you balance that, whether just in this sequence or in your episode overall.
That's character-based, I think, like that Dasha has some funny things. Clarence has a couple of like sort of funny things. He has this, tequila joke that he makes with Augie, and, Wade has that. And there's sort of like borderline dad jokes a little bit. Wade is much more character-based, like even just something as wry as, congratulations, Dr. Salazar, after she's like in tears and just broken apart by what her creation has wrought. And I think a lot of it comes with character and has to with a piece like this. And if we tried to cut for comedy, the show would reject it. The show itself will tell you, oh no, we're not having that cutting pattern. That might work in a different kind of a comedic structure. But if it's driven by a personality that's natural, then it will accept it. But it'll eject it and push it out if it doesn't play within the series tonally.
Editors will often say, and you guys held to this tradition, I have my assistant do a lot of the sound work. And Josh, you talked about that already a little bit. We discussed the visuals for this sequence, but the sound design plays such an important part as well. I mean, you're slicing through human beings, you're slicing through this giant ship. I'm going to direct this question at you, Josh, because I think you might have had a hand in this, but doing the sound design for a scene like that, tell me about that process.
Well, I enjoy the big things, but I think more than anything, you have to sort of seed it in the emotion of the scene. What's Michael going for? And so, at first, it's just hinting at the chaos to come. So, it would be inappropriate to start like really like loading in all the sounds at the top and just try to go off of what Michael did, which is we're going to slowly build into it. We're going to hint at it. And then we're going to just see the one teacher and just kind of working with that. And then knowing, okay, this is now where we step on the gas. And so then, it's building it out slowly just to try to make sure that I'm helping enhance the work that Michael's done. But then you get to a certain point where your backpacks are falling off the wall, and at that point, it's just like build into the chaos, the screaming and the smashing and the breaking. And there's an element of interpretation in terms of like, how are we representing what the slicing will look like, adding some gore just to sort of texture that in and just building into the explosions and the violence. And then at the end, really trying to emphasize how big of a thing this is with this massive, massive oil tanker just being totally obliterated and then cutting inside towards total silence. And I think that actually did a lot of the emotional work, going from these loud, big, boom scenes to cutting into just silence and observation. But really, I mean, my goal is to look at what Michael's doing, talk to Michael, try to get a sense of like what he's going for in the scene, and then just build into that and try not to step on the gas too much with the sound effects. Cause it's, I'm like, oh, explosions. And it's like, no, hold on. Let's wait. It's coming. Don't worry. And it was just trying to build along with the ride that he had cut for the scene.
And Josh's imagination would come back to me where it'd be like, okay, this character is like ducking or falling down. Well, it's like, okay, I don't need those last 10 frames because that person is toast, and sort of him informing the cut with the sonic gifts that he would present me, I was going to say. And then it would help me to sort of go, okay, right, this could be tighter, or I need to open this up more because what's this really going to sound like when we see an actual person being chopped as opposed to somebody ducking under a lamp?
Yeah, a lot of ducking in the early footage before we started seeing like, this is what it's going to look like. And then we could adjust accordingly.
I know you guys are both really busy and we're kind of out of time, but I like to end the interviews, if at all possible, with a bit about anything you might have learned from working on this project. So for each of you, anything you felt like you are taking away with you from working on Three Body Project?
I think that for me, it's the elasticity of relationships and being able to, in the same way that you can work on a scene for, hours and days and months at a time and find different values in it. The same thing with the people that you're working with and understanding the showrunners and where they're coming from, finding more of a sense of humor with them and some play. And certainly with Josh, having this give and take and back and forth, which informed our work pattern, and that we could play off each other. And the more and longer we work together, there'd be a shorthand, and having relationships is really what it's about for me.
Oh, I got to follow that up. I mentioned earlier, when I put in my resume, I was like, oh, I don't think they're going to call me. But then they did. And then getting to work with Michael and getting to work on a show like this, it's easy to kind of get lost in the weeds of everything that's happening, like with all the moving parts that are going on. It's easy to get lost in the weeds of that. But on a show like this, it's great to be able to work on something where you can take a step back and go, okay, look how cool the show is. Look how amazing this is and the people that you're working with and the opportunity to get to work with Michael. And I think it's just learning to be able to say, okay, yeah, there's a lot going on. Yeah, maybe it's a busy day. Maybe there's a lot of stress, but look what we're doing. Look at the project we're getting to work on. Look at this piece of art that we're making and look at the people you're getting to make it with. There's numerous times I had to sort of pinch myself and be like, no, yeah, this is it. You're not going to wake up. You're here. You're with Michael. You're doing this. We're chopping people. Like, it's a thing. And I think being able to just step back and go, this is amazing. This is a once in a lifetime experience. Being able to do that for as long as I was with them was truly incredible.
Well, I don't know, Josh. I think you followed Michael up pretty well there.
You want to take another shot at it, Michael?
No, I'm not following that. That was awesome.
And that, my friends, is how an assistant begins to rise up the ranks into the editor's chair. It starts by giving great, some might call them literate, answers. Thanks to both Michael and Josh for their time and all their answers. I loved having them on the show, and I certainly hope you loved listening to it. While you're in listening mode, let me fill your ears with another thought. It would be so easy for you to use the same nonlinear editing system that Michael and Josh used for Three Body Problem. The same one used by so many of your favorite films and TV shows. And that would be Avid Media Composer. Media Composer is affordably priced and grows more powerful all the time with new features for editing, speech-to-text, transcription, audio, and more. If all of this is alien to you, you see how I tied it back to Three Body Problem with the aliens there? If you're not impressed, all right, I get it. But you will be when you see all the latest that Avid Media Composer has to offer. So hit that Media Composer link in the show notes and get up to speed on Hollywood's favorite editing system. Okay, I gotta get back to work now. I don't consider doing this podcast actual work. True, it's not always easy, but it's a labor of love. And I love that you listened. Please keep on listening. Until we meet again, this is Matt Fury thanking you for joining me right here on The Rough Cut.